It is the afternoon of the 28th of June, 1943. The USS PC-815, a submarine chaser, is patrolling along the coast of the Coronado Islands off Baja, Mexico. Suddenly, the captain of the ship orders his crew to carry out some firing exercises towards the shore to test the ship's guns. 2 days later, when the ship arrives back to San Diego, the captain's superiors ask, why did he open fire on the territory of Mexico, an ally of the United States? What was worse, the same captain had only a month earlier engaged his ship in a battle against 2 alleged Japanese submarines that the Navy later decided had never existed. His superiors quickly decide to relieve the controversial captain of his command, but he escapes punishment by what he will describe as faking illness and spending the rest of the war in and out of hospital. This is just one chapter in the colourful and chaotic life of one of America's most mysterious men. His name? L. Ron Hubbard, founder of the Church of Scientology. The man known to history as L. Ron Hubbard was born on the 13th of March 1911 in the small town of Tilden in the state of Nebraska. His full name was Lafayette Ronald Hubbard. From early in his life, people began to refer to him simply as Ron. Ron's father was Harry Ross Hubbard. He was born in Fayette in Iowa, a place of origin which possibly influenced Ron's name, but coincidentally, Ron's grandfather on his mother's side was also called Lafayette. Harry entered the U.S. Navy in 1904 straight out of school and served as a junior officer for the next 3 years. He then married Ron's mother, Ledora May Waterbury, in 1909, and they moved to Nebraska. Ron was their only child. When he was 2 years old, the young family moved to Helena, the state capital of Montana. There, Harry became a bookkeeper, working first with a local theatre and then later for a coal company. Ledora worked as a clerk for the government. Ron would describe Helena as his hometown in later years, despite being born in Nebraska. The details of Hubbard's childhood and earliest years are disputed. While the basic facts can be ascertained, a lot of the finer points of detail are largely based on Hubbard's own recollections in later years, and Ron never let a good yarn get in the way of the truth. In fact, those who knew him in later life often came to the conclusion that Hubbard was a pathological liar who sometimes dropped untruths into his stories for no discernible reason. Therefore, his own accounts of his youngest years need to be approached with caution. What is beyond doubt is that his father decided to return to serving in the U.S. Navy in 1917. This was after the United States entered the First World War on the side of Britain and France in response to the recommencement of unrestricted German submarine warfare in the Atlantic Ocean and German efforts to interfere in Mexican politics. The war ended a year and a half after U.S. entry began to tip the scales against Germany and its allies in Europe. Harry Hubbard remained on in the Navy after the conflict ended, and as a result, Ron and his parents spent the late 1910s and early 1920s moving a lot. They lived for a time in Seattle, then in Washington, D.C., and even in Guam for a time. Eventually, they returned to Washington State, and Hubbard claimed he spent his teenage years back in Montana, where he lived with his grandparents so that he could finish his schooling in a more stable manner. His school performance there was lackluster, and he decided initially to try and follow his father into the Navy. He failed the entrance exam, and a further attempt to gain entry into the military by attending a preparatory school in Virginia was cut short when he was diagnosed with myopia. This precluded him from a military career given the entry requirements at the time. As the 1930s dawned, Ron was in something of a bind. He had failed to gain entry into the Navy, and his school performance had been poor enough that he had also not been offered a place in any university. To compound matters, the Wall Street crash had just occurred in October 1929, triggering the Great Depression. Jobs were being lost, not offered, and Ron was at a loose end. He consequently ended up taking a sideways entry route into university by briefly attending an additional preparatory school and gaining admission to George Washington University in the fall semester of 1930. Things did not improve there. He started out studying civil engineering and physics, but he failed most of his courses and was making little progress towards acquiring his degree. That being said, Hubbard did begin to show early potential as a writer. He began writing for the university newspaper and displayed some interest in this. However, even this pursuit was ultimately cut short when Hubbard's time at George Washington ended in 1932 without coming anywhere close to graduating, although he did make outlandish claims in later years that he was a qualified nuclear physicist. More broadly, he displayed an interest while in Washington in activities at sea. He organized a student trip to the Caribbean, for instance, to visit some of the pirate ports of the region from the golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. This turned into a debacle owing to poor planning, and several of those involved felt that Hubbard had swindled them out of their money. His interest in life at sea perhaps demonstrates a desire to impress a father who was an active Navy officer, but a rather absent figure in his son's life. Conversely, when Harry Hubbard attempted to volunteer Ron to take part in a Red Cross mission to Puerto Rico in the wake of the San Ciprian hurricane that had killed 272 people on the island at the end of September 1932, Ron abandoned the mission or route to go and pursue his peculiar fascination with piracy in the Caribbean. Ron's actions while at George Washington University and in the Caribbean in the early 1930s point towards a kind of delinquency. They were formative in some ways, or at least this is how Hubbard later described it. He would later contend that during his youth travelling around with his parents and in Washington, D.C., that he came into contact with several psychologists and therapists who were involved in the emergent field of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis had been pioneered in Vienna, Austria, and several other European cities at the end of the 19th century. It had not really become popular in America until after the First World War, and the discipline was still in its infancy when Hubbard met people like Joseph Cheeseman Thompson, a U.S. Navy commander who had developed an interest in Freudian psychoanalysis in the 1920s and whom Hubbard claimed to have known when he was a child. They supposedly maintained a correspondence for years afterwards. This was one of the many claims Hubbard made over the years about his alleged experience in the field of psychology and therapy from a young age. For instance, he would also later claim that he gained experience of how to treat schizophrenia and the symptoms associated with it as a result of having lived near Chestnut Lodge, a psychiatric institution in Maryland, in the mid-1930s, though, strangely, Hubbard referred to the clinic as Walnut Lodge. Hubbard's statements about his ties to therapists and early psychoanalysts in America in the 1920s and 1930s are disputed, and most biographers tend to view them as later attempts by Hubbard to claim a kind of expertise in the field of psychology which he simply did not possess. At the very beginning of 1933, while he was possibly living near Chestnut Lodge, Ron met Margaret Louise Grubb, a native of Beltsville, Maryland. They were both learning to fly small glider planes at the time and met on a glider airfield. They started seeing each other and got married within a few weeks, on the 13th of April 1933. They started a family as quickly as they decided to get married. Margaret was pregnant by the summer of 1933, and although she suffered a miscarriage, a second pregnancy resulted in the birth of their son, named L. Ron Jr., in May 1934. He was born 2 months prematurely. Ron Jr., who would later disavow his father and change his own name to Ronald Edward DeWolf, claimed in an interview in 1983 that his premature birth was the result of a botched abortion attempt. A second child, a daughter named Catherine, was born to Ron and Margaret in January 1936. The young family moved back to Washington State to be near his extended family while he tried to establish himself as a writer. This was the golden age of pulp fiction. Steam-powered printing presses and new paper-making techniques had made it possible to produce lengthy pulp magazines that often contained 128 pages of text printed on cheap pulp paper. In this new format, readers could buy pulp magazines with dozens of stories for a very small sum of money. As this happened, genres like fantasy fiction, science fiction, adventure yarns, and even crime and romance stories became extremely popular, and there was huge demand for writers who could produce entertaining short stories. Hubbard began writing westerns and science fiction stories and became relatively successful at this. He was known for being able to crank out a very high volume of writing, literally writing thousands of words a day when he was looking to meet deadlines. Soon, his success as a short story writer expanded into composing full novels. In 1937, his first book, Buckskin Brigades, was published. This was a western based on the settlement of the northwestern United States around Montana and Washington and the conflict between the settlers and the native Blackfeet Nation tribes. In the late 1930s, Ron was becoming successful. He was making some money and was publishing an avalanche of short stories. His finances were not stable, though. Hubbard was always someone who spent money as soon as he had acquired it, and he liked to buy high-end items. He was especially fond of sailing, and spent a lot of money on boats, a fascination that continued throughout his life. Indeed, as we'll see, a very substantial part of Hubbard's entire life story is based around boats, money, and his efforts to escape debts and taxes by living at sea, activities which have shaped the Church of Scientology that he founded down to the present day. In the late 1930s, his success provided him with opportunities for relationships outside of his marriage. He began traveling cross-country to New York from Washington State, telling Margaret that he was visiting Manhattan to meet with publishers and other writers. She was not convinced, and on occasions found evidence of his philandering ways. A family boat trip to Alaska in 1938 mended bridges for a while, but the marriage would collapse in later years. Hubbard's marriages were always plagued by accusations about his bad behavior. In 1940, he scored a major success when his novella Fear was published in Unknown Fantasy Fiction. The story focused on an ethnographer by the name of James Lowry, who has recently returned from studying ancient sites on the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America. He begins experiencing supernatural events and has a psychotic breakdown in a novella that was a classic of psychological horror and one that received excellent reviews when it was published. It is possible that Hubbard would have continued as a successful pulp fiction writer living out in the Northwest for many years to come, and that the world might never have heard of the Church of Scientology had it not been for the outbreak of the Second World War. The conflict had been underway in Europe for nearly a year when Fear was published in the summer of 1940, while the Empire of Japan had been at war with the Chinese nationalists and communists in the Far East since 1937. Right around the time Fear was published in the summer of 1940, Ron and Margaret took another boat trip north to Alaska. When they returned home in the autumn, Ron decided to try enlisting in the Navy again, perhaps predicting that the United States would soon be dragged into the conflict. This time, at nearly 30 years of age, he was accepted. His service after the U.S. entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was unusual, to say the least. He was placed in charge of various small ships. The peak of his performance came in the early summer of 1943 while patrolling off the coast of California. First, Hubbard believed he had detected an enemy submarine and spent 2.5 days dropping depth charges on it, as well as summoning other military ships in the Pacific to come to join the attack. It was determined in the official report afterwards that there was no submarine in the area. Hubbard then followed this up by attacking the Coronado Islands off the coast of Baja, California, in northwestern Mexico. The Mexican government lodged a formal complaint, and a report by the U.S. Navy concluded that strong disciplinary action would have been taken had the country not been at war. In any event, Hubbard was relieved of his command and placed as a more junior officer on larger ships or naval bases thereafter, so that he could not cause any more trouble. His conduct during the war constituted the first clear signs of his deteriorating psychological state. A major turning point in Hubbard's life came in the years immediately after the war. He was theoretically still part of the U.S. Navy until 1950, but he was inactive from late 1945. His health had declined in the final year or so of the war. Hubbard suffered from ulcers, stomach problems, and arthritic symptoms, and it has been theorized that he might have acquired a venereal disease that was also impacting on his mental state. Once he left the Navy, he did not return to Washington. Instead, he remained in California, where he had spent some of his time in port during the war. Margaret refused to relocate to California, and their marriage broke up, leading to their divorce in 1947. By that time, Margaret and the children had barely seen Ron in person in years. She would later assert that her marriage to Ron had not only been difficult because of his possible infidelity and absences from home, but because he was abusive, erratic, and threatening. Even before his divorce was finalized, Hubbard had remarried and was consequently in a bigamous relationship. His second wife was Sarah Northrop Hollister, a 22-year-old woman from Pasadena who he married in August 1946. Throughout this time, Hubbard had begun to make increasingly exaggerated claims about himself. For instance, he asserted that he had received over 20 medals for his military service, despite his rather dubious actual record. He would later describe his divorce from Margaret as having been instigated by him, even though records show that Margaret initiated it. This capacity for self-delusion, grandiosity, and the bending of the truth would characterize almost everything he did for decades to come. In California, Hubbard had initially lived with a rocket scientist by the name of John Whiteside Parsons. He was an occultist who was a California branch leader of the Ordo Templi Orientis, an occult church that had been established years earlier by the British alchemist, magician and occultist Aleister Crowley. It was while living with Parsons that Hubbard had met his second wife, Sarah Hollister. Hollister was originally Parsons' girlfriend, and the development of a romantic relationship between Hollister and Hubbard created difficulties between them. This was combined with conflict over a business they set up not long after the war ended. The trio decided on a plan whereby they would buy yachts on the East Coast and then sail them south through the Panama Canal and northwards again to the West Coast. There, they could sell them at a profit, as there was a substantial price disparity between the cost of these boats on the East and West Coasts. Although Hubbard, Parsons and Hollister were involved in the business, a majority of the financing came from Parsons, while Hubbard and Hollister ran it. They quickly fell out as Parsons came to believe that Hubbard and Hollister were swindling him out of his money. This view of Hubbard as a huckster was shared by many of Hubbard's fellow science fiction and pulp fiction writers. L. Sprague de Camp, a prominent science fiction writer of the time, who was also known for continuing a series of books on the character Conan the Barbarian, wrote to the acclaimed science fiction author Isaac Asimov around this time, noting that Hubbard was proposing to move back to the East Coast. He worried that he and Asimov, with whom de Camp had worked as a naval researcher during the war, would soon have Hubbard trying to swindle them as well. The inference in some of this correspondence is that people who knew Hubbard in the world of science fiction in the 1930s and 1940s believed something had happened to him during the war that altered his behavior. Others claimed his conduct had always been problematic, even before the war. It was during this time in 1946 and 1947 that Hubbard began working on a document entitled Affirmations that is seen as being a formative text in the development of Dianetics and the Church of Scientology. It is actually an anonymous document, but it is generally understood to have been written by Hubbard, and there are internal references within it that make it clear that he was the author. For instance, he references his eye troubles and how he had been rejected from the Naval Academy in his younger years within the text. The Affirmations is a kind of pseudo-scientific instruction manual or self-help text that aimed to hypnotize the reader into changing their life by focusing on positive affirmations. In it, Hubbard outlined his many anxieties, including his apprehension about marrying a much younger woman at a time when he felt his libido was declining. He also expressed apprehension about where his writing career was at. The text then moved on to produce a series of affirmations. These included telling himself that he was a brilliant man, that it was a good thing that his first marriage had ended, and that he had distanced himself from his family, and that his health problems would simply go away if he believed they would. Other statements bordered on the outlandish. Hubbard expressed a desire to live to be 200 years old and to remain young eternally. Elsewhere, the affirmations were strangely accurate projections of the future, though not in the way he intended. Hubbard, for instance, stated he would become rich from writing. He would soon begin to amass a considerable fortune, but it would not be from writing science and pulp fiction. The period that followed in Hubbard's life was chaotic and formative at the same time. He began writing science fiction again at a blistering pace, churning out a large amount of stories. This was connected to his financial situation. He and Sarah were not doing well money-wise after splitting from Parsons after the yacht scheme. Despite his statements in the Affirmations about leaving Margaret and his own family, he apparently wrote to both his father and father-in-law at this time, requesting financial aid, as well as approaching the Veterans Association. His pension was increased when he wrote seeking psychiatric help and claiming he had considered whether it was worth going on in life. He and Sarah moved to the state of Georgia in the middle of this, and there he began seeing a therapist. Not long after arriving there, he was arrested for using fake checks, and in August 1948 he entered a guilty plea to the charge of petty theft. Out of this existential and emotional turmoil, Hubbard developed contempt for the established field of psychology, and he began developing his own system of pseudopsychology and alternative therapy. He would call it Dianetics. The name was derived from the Greek terms dia, meaning through, and nous, meaning the mind or soul. Hence the idea was that his new system was about achieving enlightenment and healing by connecting with an impenetrable part of the mind. Hubbard was writing about elements of Dianetics by 1949. In 1950, he published his canonical book on the subject, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. Here, Hubbard described his theory about how traumatic memories, or engrams, were stored in a semi-conscious part of the mind, and that the way for people to heal their trauma was through a new form of therapy called auditing. In a sense, this was not entirely estranged from psychology as it was practiced in the middle of the 20th century. Freudian and Jungian psychoanalysis both held that the subconscious stored trauma and past experiences which were partially veiled to people's conscious minds, and that the path to healing was to work through the issues of the subconscious by therapy. What would set Dianetics apart was the pseudoscientific elements of auditing, while the system Hubbard was developing as the 1950s went on would become stranger and stranger. There was always an overt commercial element to it as well. Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, was poorly received by the mental health profession when it was published. Several reviews stated that Hubbard had simply rebranded elements of psychoanalysis and used new terms of his own devising to describe them. These reviews also noted that Hubbard's methods had not been tested in any clinical setting and could actually be dangerous. Nevertheless, the book was commercially successful, and Hubbard began touring to give lectures promoting it. He would allegedly later state to a journalist, Charlie Nairn, off the record on one of his ships while sailing off the coast of Tunisia in 1968, that he had simply written the book as a means of making money, and that he was surprised by its success. There was a lot of interest in alternative forms of therapy at the time, and while Hubbard was repackaging a lot of Freudian thought, his alternative approach sparked people's interest. The initial success of Dianetics was short-lived at the same time. In 1951, the organization Hubbard had set up to promote the new movement went bankrupt, and he subsequently lost the commercial rights to the book and associated entities in his financial settlement. This would influence a lot of his later decisions and his extraordinary efforts to avoid paying taxes in the United States for many, many years. While Dianetics was taking off, all was not well for Ron on the home front. Sarah had given birth to a baby girl who they named Alexis Valerie on the 8th of March 1950. By then, Hubbard's second marriage was already falling apart. While Ron was travelling the country promoting himself as the guru of a new form of therapy, Sarah had come to the conclusion that he was not well. Several therapists that she had consulted believed that Ron was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. One of them even suggested he would need to be institutionalized for the rest of his life. When word of Sarah's consultation with psychologists about Ron's state of mind reached him, he and several of his staff within the emerging Dianetics movement kidnapped Sarah and Alexis in March 1951. He eventually let Sarah go, but kept their daughter in his custody. A bizarre scandal followed, in which divorce proceedings were initiated, and Hubbard attempted to have the FBI arrest Sarah for being a communist infiltrator. This was at the height of the Red Scare in the US during the early stages of the Cold War, and it was a serious claim to make. At the same time, he fled to Cuba with Alexis. In later years, he stated that in the middle of these events, Sarah and her lover, Miles Hollister, had in fact kidnapped him and forced drugs up his nose while held captive. Even in 1966, he was still claiming without proof that Sarah was a secret Russian agent. The divorce proceedings were picked up by the media in 1951, and Sarah alerted the courts to the fact that Hubbard had knowingly married her while he was still married to his first wife, Margaret, meaning that he knew it was bigamy to marry Sarah in 1946. It was all highly damaging to both their reputations, even though the divorce was settled reasonably quickly in June 1951. Within a few months, Hubbard had started a relationship with Mary Sue Whip, a 20-year-old early adherent of Dianetics. He married her in 1952, and they had 4 children in the years that followed: Diana, Quentin, Mary Suzette, and Arthur. The period between 1951 and 1953 was one of reinvention for Hubbard. He not only divorced his second wife in messy circumstances and quickly remarried, he also lost control over the foundations he had set up to manage the new movement of Dianetics. He continued to write on Dianetics in spite of arguments with his business partners and the bankruptcy. In 1951, the Science of Survival was published. This was basically an expansion of his previous work on Dianetics. Here, he laid out more firmly the idea that individuals were what he called thetans, which is basically a Dianetics term for the soul. The thetan existed within the body and was more durable than human bodies. As such, Hubbard argued that people had past lives and that their thetan had passed through many bodies in the past. As with his book on Dianetics the previous year, Hubbard was essentially just rebranding certain classical concepts and incorporating them into his system. In this case, though, the concepts were derived from several religions rather than psychoanalysis. For instance, the thetan is analogous to the soul in many belief systems, while the idea of past lives is basically the Hindu concept of reincarnation. It was significant at the same time that he was now incorporating religious ideas rather than strictly psychoanalytical concepts. A year later, in 1952, Hubbard began speaking about his work as the philosophy of Scientology and introduced the E-meter as a device for reading emotions during auditing. Then, a year after that, in 1953, having previously set up the Hubbard Association of Scientologists, he incorporated what he called the Church of Scientology in New Jersey. The Church of Scientology grew quickly after Hubbard established it. He traveled constantly to promote it, attending conferences of the fledgling Scientology movement in Philadelphia one month, and then lecturing across New Jersey the next. Then he was on the West Coast a few months after that to incorporate the church in California and Arizona. In 1955, a branch of the church was established abroad in the state of Victoria in Australia. In the midst of this, an important change occurred. On Christmas Eve 1954, a symbolically important date within a primarily Christian country like the United States, he announced that Scientology was now a religion. Concurrently, Hubbard was continuing to write and publish new books. These were now expanding into more unusual territory. While the original fundamentals of Dianetics and Scientology had borrowed extensively from psychoanalysis and religious metaphysics, basically just changing the names of concepts like the subconscious, the soul, and reincarnation, and repackaging them, from 1952 forwards, Hubbard was publishing ever more alternative theories. At the end of that year, for instance, he published Scientology 88008. This claimed to be a study of the electronics of human thought and how the thetan created energy. Infinity was discussed a lot here. The symbolism of the number 8 and 0 in the title was important. A sideways 8 was the infinity symbol within the kind of occult thinking associated with Aleister Crowley and the Ordo Templi Orientis that Hubbard had briefly been associated with in California after the war. Yet again, Hubbard was borrowing concepts from older thought systems and repurposing them. He was always on the lookout for ways to legitimize the new movement during the years in which he established the Scientology movement. In February 1953, for instance, he acquired a doctorate, basically by mail order, from the unaccredited Sequoia University in California. Following this, he frequently began describing himself as Dr. L. Ron Hubbard. Not long after he had incorporated the Church of Scientology in California, Hubbard had sought tax-exempt status for the organization based on its position as a religious movement. This was granted initially, but in 1958, the IRS decided to revoke the tax exemption in Washington, D.C., where Hubbard and his family and closest followers had relocated, hoping to benefit from the city's unusual laws, since it is not a state or within a state. Trouble followed him there. The IRS had looked into the methods being used within Hubbard's growing church and came to the conclusion that the Church of Scientology was actually a business masquerading as a religion, the goal of which was to make Hubbard money. The Church had already begun to set up a system where there were paid tiers, which members ascended through, only learning about certain elements of the religion once they had undertaken a certain amount of auditing and training. Even though the movement was comparatively small when compared with other religions, this methodology meant that it had a large amount of income. By 1957 and 1958, when the IRS was investigating its affairs, the Church was paying Hubbard about $250,000 a year, several million in modern terms. Hubbard now decided that he was unwilling to remain in America to pay taxes on the money he was making. He therefore set off across the Atlantic and bought St. Hill Manor in Sussex, in southern England, an 18th century listed country house. He would spend the better part of the next decade here, and St. Hill became a kind of training center for the Church of Scientology in exile. It was in the 1960s, while he was becoming a kind of international nomadic leader of Scientology, that Hubbard first devised the operating thetans within the movement. This would evolve over time, and new levels were added as late as the 1980s after Hubbard died, but the basic principles were established at this earlier time. The operating thetans, or levels, which are often abbreviated as OT1, OT2, OT3, and so forth, are levels that members of the Scientology movement must move through to reach a place of spiritual freedom. The whole system would become known as the Bridge to Total Freedom. Only once a person has been designated as clear through auditing via the Church are they judged as eligible to begin the operating thetans. The earlier stages involve confronting a person's own existence and past lives, while OT3 is called the Wall of Fire. This is where the Scientologist is informed about the alleged history of the universe starting 75 million years ago. At stage 5, or OT5, a second wall of fire is reached in which a person is audited for about 50 hours about subjects like living lightning. By the time a person gets to OT6 or OT7, they are quite senior within the Scientology movement, while OT8 was classed as Truth Revealed and was only released in 1988 after Hubbard died. Therefore, even though Hubbard had stated that there were 15 levels of operating thetans, he was alleged to have passed from his living body to begin exploring the higher thetan levels. Those who undertake these operating thetans within the Church of Scientology pay thousands of dollars for sessions, and there can be numerous sessions for the auditing involved in each operating thetan, meaning that to go through each of the OT levels can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. As Hubbard continued to add layers of complexity to Scientology in the 1960s, the Church itself grew and ran into challenges at the same time. In the US, its membership was expanding, but there was increased regulatory pressure on it. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, which had oversight for the regulation of medical devices as well in America, had begun to investigate the use of e-meters for auditing. In January 1963, raids were launched against multiple Scientology centers across the country, and approximately 100 of the devices were seized in a sign that the FDA did not intend to allow Hubbard to peddle unproven medical methods without government consent. 2 years later, in Australia, the government there decided to begin prohibiting Scientology altogether, stating that the auditing process was a form of cult-like hypnosis, not therapy. These crackdowns in the US and Australia led to the British government launching an investigation into Hubbard's affairs at St Hill Manor. Aware that his time in the United Kingdom might be coming to an end, Hubbard went on a fact-finding mission to Rhodesia, the forerunner of modern-day Zimbabwe. A white minority government had recently declared its independence from British colonial rule and was mired in the first stages of a bush war against the black majority. Notwithstanding the conflict, white settlement in Rhodesia continued to grow in the late 1960s and into the 1970s as the government tried to shift the demographic balance. Scientology, though, was not wanted. Hubbard was asked to leave the country. As a result, he and his closest followers effectively took to the sea. With the UK becoming increasingly hostile towards them, Hubbard and his party spent the next several years largely living at sea, sailing around between places like Morocco, the Canary Islands, Tunisia, and the Caribbean. As Hubbard moved his operations to sea, he established Sea Org in August 1967, a branch of the Church of Scientology which has become more controversial than any of the others. This was right at the time that he had acquired the HMS Royal Scotsman, a British-built passenger ship that had been converted for military purposes during the Second World War and served in the North Africa campaign. The Scotsman, along with two other ships, the Avon River and the Enchanter, became the first armada of Sea Org. They were renamed Diana, Athena, and Apollo, three deities from ancient Greek mythology. Hubbard was the commodore, and Sea Org was the umbrella organization for his band of followers on the high seas as the leadership of the church became a marine-based entity. Thus, Sea Org was born out of Hubbard's legal difficulties in the 1960s with the IRS and the FDA in the United States and with various governments elsewhere. It is difficult to escape the idea that there was a complex psychology at work here. Hubbard's father had been a naval officer, while Hubbard's own naval career had been humiliating. First, he had been rejected from the Navy when he tried to join as a young man, and then when he was accepted during the war and placed in charge of his own ship, he had performed abysmally and had to largely be demoted. Here he was now, decades later, creating his miniature navy within the Scientology movement. Soon it would grow into a major part of the hierarchy of Scientology, and even today, long after Hubbard's passing and Scientology's return to land, Sea Org is a central feature of the church. This was not the only addition to the hierarchical structure of the church. A year earlier, in 1966, Hubbard had set up the Guardian's Office. The purpose of this was to guard the interests of Hubbard and the church. Only the most committed Scientologists would be chosen as guardians. It was set up in the tumultuous period following the FDA crackdown in the US and as Hubbard's activities had come under investigation in Britain. The idea was to start compiling dossiers of information on the perceived enemies of the church and to safeguard its interest. Hubbard placed his wife, Mary Sue, in charge. The Guardian's Office also became a kind of middle management system for the church at a time when Hubbard had been away from the US for years. The Guardian's Office became responsible in the 1970s for what were probably the most inflammatory actions ever engaged in by Hubbard. These were covert missions he initiated like Operation Snow White and Operation Freakout, which targeted specific enemies of the church. Operation Freakout aimed to try and have the journalist Paulette Cooper committed to an asylum or imprisoned in revenge for her publication of The Scandal of Scientology in 1971, a book which attacked Hubbard's church as a cult. Operation Snow White was even more incendiary. Through this, Hubbard had targeted hundreds of government offices in the US, including those of the IRS and the FDA. These were infiltrated by Scientologists to try and remove any evidence or documentation which portrayed the church in a negative light. This even involved wiretapping of US government bodies. Operation Snow White would eventually result in criminal prosecutions and imprisonments at the end of the 1970s. As the actions of the Guardian's office and the illegal behavior of the leading Scientologists indicate, Hubbard was becoming increasingly paranoid and conspiratorial in the 1970s. This not only manifested in Operation Snow White and Operation Freakout. It was also leading to a tense and abusive regime within Sea Org. In the late 1960s, Hubbard had developed the Mud Box Brigade as a method of punishing members of his fleet whose performance was deemed unsatisfactory. The name of the brigade derives from them having been assigned the task of cleaning out the filthy suction pipe in the bilge of the ship, which is basically a mud box designed to filter waste so that it does not get into the pump of a ship. This later was turned into a more systematic way of maintaining control over the crew when Rehabilitation Unit and then the Rehabilitation Project Force were established in 1969 and 1974. Those who were assigned to Project Force were either made to undergo hours of auditing and learning every day, or else given mundane and difficult manual labor. This was a sign of where his leadership was now going, and combined with the illegal activity he was forcing his followers to engage in, clearly points more towards a harmful cult rather than a religion of any normal kind. Things only got worse as the 1970s went on. On the 12th of November 1976, Ron's son, Quentin, died at 22 years of age. He had been on life support for 2 weeks after being found in his car in Las Vegas with a hose connected to the tailpipe leading into the car window. Hubbard's mental state deteriorated following this, as Quentin had been viewed as his probable successor. Meanwhile, in France, the government found Hubbard guilty of fraud in an absentia trial and sentenced him to 4 years in prison for charges related to the Church of Scientology's activities in the country. The illegality of the 1970s peaked in the trial of 11 members of the church, including Ron's own wife, Mary Sue, over Operation Snow White in October 1979. Hubbard was not amongst the 11 defendants, as he was not directly tied to any of the illegal activity. He was indicted as a co-conspirator, and this meant he went into hiding with a small number of followers in the northwestern United States at the end of the 1970s. Incredibly, Hubbard sent a series of messengers to his wife while she was in legal limbo to politely ask her if she might consider divorcing him. They never officially divorced, but he also never saw her again. She distanced herself from the Scientology movement and after years of fighting her sentence, eventually served 1 year in prison in the mid-1980s. Meanwhile, Hubbard's health was deteriorating as he neared his 70s. He collapsed while filming a video in 1978 and lapsed into a coma temporarily. The cause was a pulmonary embolism. By then, Hubbard was fully sold on his own healing methods, despite the perception that he had created the entire field of Dianetics and auditing in the 1950s simply as a way of making money. He became convinced his illness and bad run of luck was owing to improper auditing. In 1981, as he continued to move around incognito along the West Coast, he established the All Clear Unit, a division of the church tasked with making it all clear for Hubbard to come out of hiding. Eventually, he settled down in California again, living in a luxury motorhome on a ranch in rural California. Investigations by the government continued at the same time that Forbes estimated his wealth as being around $200 million. That figure was revised upwards to nearly $400 million by the time he died, which is well in excess of $1 billion in modern terms. Although Hubbard's lifestyle was unorthodox even by his standards in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he did manage to return to writing during this period. Hubbard had been an incredibly prolific writer in the 1930s and 1940s, churning out a massive amount of short stories and a good few books and collections of stories. Even at the start of the 1950s, as he was developing Dianetics, he continued to write and edit some science fiction work for publication. For instance, two of Hubbard's earlier science fiction books, Fear and The Typewriter in the Sky, were republished by him as a dual edition in 1951. Thereafter, he largely departed from science fiction and focused more on writing about Dianetics and pseudo-psychology. As time went by in the 1960s and 1970s, his output of any kind declined. He published some books during this later period of his life, but they were often repackaged statements about Dianetics and Scientology. It was strange, then, that Hubbard suddenly decided, late in his life, while trying to evade the authorities in his late 60s and early 70s, to return to science fiction after 3 decades away from the genre. The first outcome was Battlefield Earth, which was initially entitled as Man, the Endangered Species. It was set in 3000 AD, by which time an alien species known as the Cyclos had ruled Earth for 1,000 years. The book explores how the Cyclos had come to dominate large parts of the universe and how they are overthrown by the fragments of humanity on Earth. The subtext is suffused with elements of Scientology and was also a thinly disguised attack on modern psychological methods. The book was very long, over 400,000 words, and when it was adapted into a film that starred John Travolta, only the first half of the novel was used as material. The film was critically slaughtered on its release in 2000, and a planned sequel that would have adapted the second half of the book was never made. Hubbard spent some of his last years promoting the idea that Battlefield Earth should be adapted into a Hollywood film, but he was unable to have this realized during his lifetime, in part because Travolta, the guiding light behind the film adaptation, was in the midst of a career lull in the 1980s after his success following Grease and Saturday Night Fever in the 1970s. It was only after he starred in Pulp Fiction and Get Shorty in the mid-1990s that he was able to have half of Hubbard's book adapted for the screen. As he was attempting to have Battlefield Earth adapted into a film, Hubbard had returned to California. He was no longer really on the run, but he continued to largely live in hiding. Incredibly, During the mid-1980s, he authored a 10-volume series of science fiction books known as Mission Earth. Only the first volume, entitled The Invader's Plan, was published while he was still alive. Thereafter, the other 9 volumes appeared in print in quick succession. They ran in total to 1.2 million words and nearly 4,000 pages. Although the second volume, Black Genesis, was nominated for the Hugo Award, one of the 2 foremost science fiction writing awards in the world, it did not win. In contrast to this nomination, the New York Times reviewed the series as showing a, quote, disregard of conventional grammar so global as to suggest a satire on the possibility of communication through language. It was Hubbard's last major act. He suffered a stroke on the 17th of January 1986 and died a week later on the 24th of January in California. He was 74 years of age. Fittingly, after he was cremated, his ashes were scattered at sea, though the Church of Scientology states that he actually only abandoned his body in 1986 to explore other planes of existence. Hubbard's death certainly did not mean that the Church of Scientology was destined to collapse. In fact, one of the really strange things is that the church had existed for decades, almost independent of its founder. Hubbard was central to its establishment back in the 1950s and certainly managed elements of it through the 1960s and 1970s. At the same time, he had regularly done so from a distance. The home of the church was really in California, whereas Hubbard spent years traveling the world. In an age before the internet, it was difficult for someone to manage a movement like this remotely, and Scientology was essentially managed through middlemen and middlewomen for a substantial proportion of Hubbard's later life. It was difficult, or even nigh on impossible, to play an active role in managing an organization in California while boating around the Mediterranean or living in hiding in the northwestern United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Hence, there had always been an operational hierarchy that managed the church's affairs and that continued to operate long after Hubbard's death. By then, the church had also grown in size. Although determining the number of Scientologists worldwide is a notoriously difficult thing to do, it is believed that the church may have grown from a few thousand adherents in the 1950s to upwards of 100,000 by the end of the 1960s. That stretched into several 100,000 in the 1970s, with branches in countries like Britain and Australia. By the time of Hubbard's death, there may have been in excess of 1 million Scientologists, though critics argue that the number of adherents of the church is grossly exaggerated by the church authorities themselves, and it has far fewer followers than is often suggested. Whatever the true number, there is no denying that it had become a substantial enough entity during Hubbard's lifetime. For instance, as a point of comparison, its growth in the 3 decades between when Hubbard founded the church and when he died was considerably more substantial than the Christian movement during the 30 or so years after the death of Jesus Christ. The Church of Scientology has moved from controversy to controversy ever since Hubbard's own time. It is controlled these days by David Miscavige. His family had joined the church when he was a child, and he then became a member of Sea Org in 1976 at 16 years of age. In the period that followed, he built up a close relationship with Hubbard, and by the start of the 1980s he was a powerful figure within the church despite his youth. In Hubbard's final years, it was clear that Miscavige was the leader in waiting, and in 1986 he became the second head of the Church of Scientology at 25 years of age. Miscavige reorganized certain elements of the church while also keeping in place other branches such as Sea Org. It has continued to be a main source of criticism for the church. People who have left the church have argued that it acts as the central element of a cult-like institution where members are treated like slaves and forced to engage in unpaid labor, while those who try to leave are subjected to sustained campaigns of harassment and intimidation. These claims reached a fever pitch in the 2010s as a number of high-profile books, investigative documentaries and films appeared on the church criticizing how it is run and Miscavige's leadership. The church has its defenders as well. Part of the reason why it has become so well known, despite its comparatively small size, is that many prominent Hollywood actors such as Tom Cruise and John Travolta are members. They have defended the church and Miscavige from its detractors. The influence of Scientology in Hollywood is also a legacy of Hubbard. It was his idea to set up a Celebrity Center International in Hollywood in 1973. The Church of Scientology is known all over the world today and has become infamous because of the scandals associated with certain branches of the church. The strange thing about this is that there is much less public awareness of the peculiar life of the religion's founder, L. Ron Hubbard. In fact, his life, and how it overlaps with the growth of the church, makes little sense in many ways. He had a troubled enough upbringing and tried his hand at numerous professions early on in his life before turning to writing science fiction and pulp fiction. He was successful at these, and Hubbard was considered a prolific writer in the late 1930s and 1940s. Some of his science fiction and pulp fiction remains relatively well regarded. Yet there were already signs of psychological instability and peculiar behavior on Hubbard's part in the 1930s and 1940s, claims substantiated by his first 2 wives. This possibly explains his erratic service record during the Second World War and his criminal record after it. He reinvented himself in the 1950s, first as the inventor of Dianetics, a kind of pseudo-scientific mix of religion and psychology, and then as a full-blown religious leader. The second half of his life thereafter was bizarre at times. He spent years travelling the world, a lot of the time with the sole goal of avoiding paying taxes, though sometimes because he found himself in various kinds of legal trouble in countries like the United States and France. Despite his wanderings and at times reclusive life, the Church of Scientology expanded dramatically, almost as though the sheer mystique surrounding Hubbard made it more popular. Concurrently, many of the allegedly most abusive wings of Scientology, including Sea Org, were created by him, and through initiatives like Operation Snow White, the church developed a reputation for illegal, cult-like conduct. Long after Hubbard's death, or his passing from his mortal body, as Scientologists would have it, the church he created continues to arouse controversy and has developed into a multi-billion-dollar entity. What do you think of L. Ron Hubbard? Was he a complete charlatan and a deeply maladjusted individual who abused those around him and created a paranoid pseudo-religious movement? Or are the crimes associated with the Church of Scientology overblown? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.